I've seen some strange things in my life, but nothing compares to what happened in Silver Ridge in 1995. Imagine waking up one morning and finding out that an entire town, over 300 people, simply ceased to exist. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just gone. Here's the thing though, it wasn't just a freak event, I think it was deliberate. And what's worse, I think it's going to happen again. The government knows exactly what happened to the people of Silver Ridge, and they've been trying to cover it up ever since. I wasn't supposed to be in Silver Ridge that night. It was a small, forgotten town nestled in the Oregon mountains, and I was just passing through on my way to Portland. I remember it so clearly. The eerie quiet as I pulled into town, a thick fog rolling in. Something felt off. I stopped at a diner around 7 p.m., ordered a coffee, and chatted with the waitress. She seemed nice enough, told me there was a festival happening the next day and that I should stay the night to check it out. As I sipped my coffee, a few locals trickled in. Everything seemed so normal, except for this strange feeling that gnawed at me. Around 9 p.m., I left the diner and checked into a cheap motel at the edge of town. The fog had thickened, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I settled into my room and turned on the TV, trying to shake the unease. Just as I was about to fall asleep, the power went out. I didn't think much of it. Small towns have outages all the time, right? But when I woke up the next morning, the town was dead. And I mean that literally. I walked out of my motel room to find the streets completely empty. Cars were still parked in their driveways, front doors were left wide open, and half-eaten plates of food sat on tables inside the diner. It was like everyone had just gotten up and walked out in the middle of whatever they were doing. I drove up and down the streets for hours, calling out, trying to find someone, anyone, but the town was a ghost. And then I noticed something strange. At the outskirts of the town, where the road led out of Silver Ridge, military trucks were parked, and men in black suits were standing by, watching. They didn't try to stop me as I drove out, but I could feel their eyes burning into my back. That was when I knew something wasn't right. What I discovered later was horrifying. According to some people I spoke to afterward, Silver Ridge wasn't the first town to disappear like this. And every time it happens, the government sweeps it under the rug, claiming natural disasters, accidents, or gas leaks. But the truth? These people aren't gone because of some freak event. They were taken. I think it's part of some secret experiment. I couldn't let it go. I did some digging, found old newspaper clippings, talked to former government employees who knew about classified projects. And here's the kicker. Every town that disappeared had reported strange sightings in the days before. Not UFOs, not ghosts, but shadowy figures, people in dark suits. And the strangest part? Every single person who had gone missing was found, decades later, not aged a day. If you're enjoying this mystery, hit like and subscribe for more twists you won't see coming. Just last week, I started seeing the same black-suited men near my own town. They've been parked outside my house at night, watching. I'm afraid to leave, but I'm even more afraid to stay, because I know what's coming next. I've seen it before. We've all heard the stories of UFO sightings, of strange lights in the sky, of alien abductions that defy logic. But what if I told you those stories are just a distraction? What if the truth is far more terrifying, and it involves experiments on us? I've seen the tapes, and I'm here to tell you, they're not about aliens. They're about something much worse. The alien tapes aren't proof of extraterrestrial life. They're evidence of a government experiment on human subjects, an experiment that continues to this day. It started with a leaked video. You might have seen it. It made the rounds on conspiracy forums a few years back before being scrubbed from the internet. It showed what looked like a typical UFO sighting, a blurry craft hovering over a desert landscape, military vehicles in the distance. But it was what happened next that sent chills down my spine. The camera zoomed in, and you could see something, or someone, being escorted off the craft. It wasn't an alien, though. It was a man, strapped to a stretcher, unconscious. The military surrounded him like he was a prisoner. As they loaded him into a van, the video cut out. I became obsessed. Who was that man? What happened to him? And why was no one talking about this? After weeks of searching, I got in touch with a guy who claimed to have inside information, an ex-military contractor. He told me something I still can't fully wrap my head around. According to him, the UFOs we've all been told to focus on aren't the real mystery. They're decoys. The government has been experimenting on humans for years, using UFOs as cover stories to distract the public. These alien crafts? They're built by us, part of some top-secret project designed to manipulate human biology. And the man in the video? He was a test subject. But here's where it gets even weirder. This guy told me that not all the subjects survive these experiments. In fact, most don't. The ones who do are different. He wouldn't say what happens to them, but he hinted at something mutational. The government keeps them hidden, but once in a while, one escapes. That's when we hear about alien abductions or UFO crashes. They're just cover-ups for when things go wrong. And the worst part? The man in that video was found dead months later, his body dumped in the desert, completely unrecognizable. Just last week, I received an anonymous package. Inside was a single piece of paper. All it said was, "You're next. I think I'm being watched." Story 3. The terrifying truth about Roswell. It wasn't a UFO, it was worse. For years, we've been told that Roswell was just a UFO crash site, a mysterious but harmless glimpse into the unknown. But I'm here to tell you that's the lie. I've uncovered something far darker. Roswell wasn't about little green men. What happened there was a bioweapons disaster that the government couldn't contain. And the fallout? Well, some say it never really ended. The Roswell incident was not a UFO crash. It was a government experiment involving bioweapons, and the truth has been buried for over 70 years. You've heard the official story 1,000 times. In 1947, a flying saucer supposedly crashed in the desert outside Roswell, New Mexico. The military swooped in, collected the wreckage, and the whole thing was written off as a weather balloon. But I've spoken to people who were there, and what they told me makes my skin crawl. Back in the 1990s, I worked with a man named Sam, a former government contractor who'd spent most of his career at classified research sites. He wasn't a UFO nut, but he knew secrets, real ones. One night, after a few too many drinks, Sam started talking about Roswell. He didn't laugh it off like most people did. Instead, he got real quiet, and what he said next changed everything I thought I knew about the incident. Sam told me that in the months leading up to Roswell, the military had been conducting secret tests in the desert. Bioweapons tests. They were working with something new, a substance unlike anything the world had seen. He didn't know where it came from, but it wasn't man-made, at least not entirely. It was rumored to have been discovered in the Arctic, something ancient, something alive. And then, during one of those tests, something went horribly wrong. According to Sam, the UFO that crashed in Roswell wasn't from outer space at all. It was a military craft carrying this bioweapon. The payload was supposed to be secure, but the crash released the substance into the desert, infecting the surrounding area. That's why the military moved so fast to shut everything down. It wasn't about aliens. They were trying to contain a disaster of their own making. But here's where it gets even darker. People in Roswell started getting sick. They called it desert fever. At first, just a bad flu. But then the symptoms got worse. People reported hallucinations, seeing ghostly figures walking through town at night. Some claimed to hear voices whispering in the desert wind. A few months later, several locals disappeared. No one ever found their bodies. And you know what else? The cleanup wasn't about hiding UFO debris. It was about sterilizing the site, trying to erase any trace of the weapon. But it didn't work. Whatever that substance was, it had a life of its own. A few years ago, I went back to Roswell, not for the tourist stuff, but to talk to locals, to dig deeper. Some of the old-timers are still terrified to speak openly, but one man told me something that chilled me to the bone. He said, "You think it's over? That thing never really left." And then, as I was driving out of town, I swear I saw something in the desert. A figure moving through the dust, watching. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it wasn't. We've all heard about Roanoke, the colony that vanished without a trace, leaving only the cryptic word Croatoan behind. Historians have spent centuries debating what happened to them. But what if I told you they didn't disappear? What if they were taken? I've uncovered something that suggests the lost colony was part of an early experiment, one involving time travel. And the terrifying part? That experiment might still be happening. The settlers of Roanoke didn't just vanish. They were subjects in a government time travel experiment gone wrong, and there's proof it's still being covered up. I started digging through old archives, finding scattered references to strange phenomena around Roanoke at the time of its disappearance. Lights in the sky, people claiming to see visitors in their dreams. But the real breakthrough came when I discovered an old government document, buried deep in an unrelated file from the 1940s. It referenced an anomaly near the Roanoke settlement site and described efforts to contain a temporal disturbance. Temporal disturbance? I thought it had to be a joke, a typo, but then I found more. Just last year, a historian I'd been working with, someone who had access to more classified documents, vanished without a trace. The last thing he sent me was a single cryptic message. The Roanoke project never stopped. It's happening again. Since then, I've seen men watching my house, following me in the streets. And I've been hearing whispers at night in a language I don't understand. I don't know how much time I have left. As I drove away from Roswell that day, the desert seemed to stretch on forever and the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. The figure I had seen, a hazy, indistinct silhouette in the distance, was gone, but the feeling it left behind stuck with me. After that trip, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what the locals had said, how whatever they released during that crash in 1947 was still out there. And the more I thought about it, the more I started noticing something strange. Reports of odd illnesses and disappearances were spiking in areas around New Mexico again. This time they were labeling it radiation poisoning, but no one was buying that. People were getting sick, hearing voices, and seeing things that shouldn't be there. A few months later, I received an anonymous email from someone claiming to work at a classified government site. The message was short and cryptic. "You're looking in the wrong place. Roswell was just the beginning. They've moved the project. It's still active." There was an attachment too, a map. The location circled in red, a stretch of desert near White Sands Missile Range. I thought long and hard before deciding to follow the lead. Part of me didn't want to know, but the other part couldn't let it go. So I packed my bags and drove straight into the heart of the desert. When I reached the area circled on the map, I saw nothing at first. Just dunes and endless open sky. But after hours of searching, I found it. A fenced-off compound, heavily guarded, with warning signs posted everywhere. That's when I saw them. A convoy of military trucks driving in from the distance, moving slowly toward the compound. What was inside? It wasn't just supplies, and it wasn't soldiers. Through my binoculars, I could see what looked like large metal containers, all sealed up tight, and one of them was glowing faintly, an eerie green light leaking from cracks in its sides. I don't know what I was looking at, but it sure as hell wasn't human. As the trucks disappeared into the compound, I heard something, faint at first but growing louder. It was like a low hum, vibrating through the ground, followed by a strange, static-like noise in my ears. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The next thing I remember is waking up in my car, miles from the compound, my head pounding and my vision blurry. It was like I had lost time. My phone had been wiped clean. No photos, no messages, nothing left to prove I was ever there. But when I got home, I found a single new email waiting for me. All it said was, "They know, it's only a matter of time. I don't know who sent it. But now, I can't shake the feeling that something's coming. And I don't know if we'll be ready when it does." You've probably heard about number stations, the creepy broadcasts of random numbers and sounds coming from seemingly nowhere. Some say they're Cold War relics, used by spies to communicate in code. But I found something much darker. One station in particular is broadcasting something wrong. The signal? It's not coming from Earth. And I have reason to believe it's trying to communicate with something far more dangerous than we ever imagined. The so-called number stations aren't just spy communications. They're signals sent to or from another dimension. And they might be opening doors that should have stayed closed. It all started a few years ago on a rainy night in October. I was scanning through shortwave radio frequencies, looking for the usual oddities, cryptic broadcasts, strange Morse code, the kind of thing that makes you feel like you're tapping into some forgotten part of the world. I was used to hearing the standard number stations, monotonous voices reading sequences of numbers, static, and beeping tones. But that night, something different came through. At first, it sounded like a typical numbers broadcast, but then the numbers started repeating, over and over again. And beneath the numbers, I heard something else, a low, almost imperceptible hum, like a second voice hidden in the static. The longer I listened, the more I realized this wasn't random. It was deliberate. I recorded the signal and ran it through some audio software, trying to isolate the hum. After hours of cleaning up the static, I discovered something chilling. The hum wasn't just background noise, it was a voice. A voice speaking in a language I couldn't understand, repeating the same phrase again and again. I became obsessed. I scoured the internet looking for anyone who had heard something similar. Most number stations had been cataloged and dismissed as spy operations, but this one wasn't listed anywhere. It didn't officially exist. Finally, after months of searching, I found a forum deep in the dark corners of the web where people discussed unusual broadcasts. And that's where I met someone who claimed to know the truth. He went by the username Wavelength, and he claimed he had been studying number stations for years. He told me that the station I'd found wasn't transmitting from Earth. According to him, it was part of an old, secret government project called Project Echo. The project was designed to send signals into space, not to communicate with aliens, but to reach into parallel dimensions. He said the government had discovered that radio waves could sometimes slip through the cracks between realities. In 1972, they began experimenting, sending out signals to see what, if anything, would respond. Most of the time, they got nothing but silence. But then, one day, something answered. The signal I'd found? It wasn't just a transmission, it was a reply. The deeper I dug, the more disturbing things became. Wavelength sent me documents, leaked reports, transcripts of radio transmissions, classified memos. They described how, after that first response, strange things started happening. People working on the project began experiencing hallucinations, visions of shadowy figures, hearing voices that didn't belong to anyone in the room. One report described an incident where a researcher disappeared entirely, right in front of his colleagues. They said it was like he was pulled out of reality. One second he was there, the next he was just gone. The project was shut down soon after, and all records were sealed. Officially, it never existed, but the transmissions never stopped. The signal I picked up was still broadcasting, and according to wavelength, it was calling out to something on the other side, something that might not be friendly. Just as I was about to meet Wavelength in person to get more information, he vanished. His forum account was deleted, his email bounced back, and his apartment was empty, like he had never existed. But before he disappeared, he sent me one final message. Don't listen too long. The more you hear, the more they can hear you. The signal has been stronger lately. I keep hearing it, even when my radio is turned off. And sometimes in the middle of the night, I hear whispers. Not through the radio, but from the other side of my bedroom door. I think they know I've been listening, and I think they're coming for me next. Everyone knows about the Zodiac Killer, the faceless monster who terrorized California in the 1960s. But what if everything we think we know is wrong? What if the truth isn't about one deranged man, but a coordinated, state-sponsored effort to cover something far more sinister? I've uncovered evidence that suggests the Zodiac killings weren't just random acts of violence, they were orchestrated. And the worst part, the government may have been involved. The Zodiac Killer wasn't one person, it was a network of killers working under the protection of a shadowy government operation, using the murders as a cover for something far more insidious. I grew up hearing the stories about the Zodiac Killer, the gruesome murders, the cryptic letters, the taunting messages to the police. It was the stuff of nightmares. But what bothered me most wasn't the killings themselves. It was the fact that the Zodiac was never caught. Despite the overwhelming evidence, despite the letters and the attention, the case remains unsolved to this day. And that always felt convenient. Then, a few years ago, I came across something that made my blood run cold. I was doing research on unsolved crimes for a documentary project when I stumbled upon a collection of declassified FBI documents. Buried among them was a memo that suggested something no one had ever considered publicly. There may have been more than one Zodiac Killer. The memo hinted that some of the murders attributed to the Zodiac had distinct differences in style and execution. The FBI had suspected copycats for years, but what if it wasn't just a copycat? What if the Zodiac persona was being used by multiple killers, working together or worse, under someone's orders? I started digging deeper, and that's when I found connections I couldn't ignore. Some of the murders attributed to the Zodiac bore similarities to assassinations carried out by known operatives in covert government operations, strategic hits disguised as random acts of violence. The Zodiac letters, too, had markings that weren't just taunts. They resembled military-grade encryption codes, the kind used by intelligence agencies. At first, I thought I was seeing patterns where there weren't any, but the more I looked, the clearer it became. The Zodiac wasn't a lone psychopath. The killings were part of something bigger, something meant to look like chaos, but underneath, there was order, a purpose. I managed to track down a retired FBI agent, someone who had worked on the Zodiac case back in the day. He was reluctant to talk at first, but after a few meetings, he finally opened up. He didn't tell me everything, but he gave me enough to follow a trail. According to him, the FBI knew, or at least suspected, that the Zodiac killings were part of a larger operation. They had uncovered links between the murders and covert government projects, particularly ones involving psychological warfare experiments. That's right, psychological warfare. The killings were intended to instill fear, to keep the public in a state of terror while other, more secretive operations were carried out under the radar. But the public couldn't know that, so the Zodiac legend was allowed to grow. The letters were treated as cryptic puzzles, distractions that kept people guessing while the real agenda went unnoticed. But here's where it gets even darker. Some of the murders may not have been planned by the original Zodiac at all. Several of the killings happened at key times when political or military operations were going on nearby. According to my source, these murders were state-sanctioned hits carried out by trained operatives to eliminate targets: journalists, whistleblowers, people who had seen too much. The Zodiac persona provided the perfect cover. No one would suspect that government forces were involved in what looked like the work of a deranged killer. And the cryptic Zodiac letters? They weren't just random messages meant to taunt the police. They were coded communications between insiders, people in the know who were part of the operation. Some of the letters contained patterns that matched encrypted military communications used during covert missions. It was all hidden in plain sight. Just when I thought I was getting close to the truth, my source disappeared. His phone was disconnected, and his home was cleaned out. No trace of him anywhere. But before he vanished, he left me with a final message. If you keep digging, they'll come for you too. Some things are better left buried. Hit like and subscribe if you want more unsolved mysteries that'll keep you awake at 3 a.m. questioning everything you thought you knew. Want to know what really happens at IHOP after midnight? Click the video on your screen right now, and for a deep dive into even more eerie stories, hit the playlist in the top left. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. Since then, I've started noticing strange cars parked outside my house. My emails have been hacked, and more than once, I've seen men in suits watching me from a distance. The Zodiac Killer may have been just a front, but whatever they were covering up back then, it's still happening. And now, I might be the next target.